institutional offerings and enrollees were in non-credit education. And certainly I can tell you for the universities that I've worked in that have a strong workforce, it's a substantial amount of their public mission. For community colleges, in many cases, the non-credit enrollment is larger than the regular, quote-unquote, enrollment, credit enrollment. And so you have what one of my friends, researcher, did when he analyzed what was the hidden college, the shadow college. The college that when people found out I was working on this paper with CLASP and the people there said, you better not do anything to upset the apple cart because that's a free zone where we can do things without academic interference. And we can get programs through, and we can charge more. Okay. The second reason is the increased focus on awarding credit for non-credit learning. I worked with Cale when I came to Kentucky, because when I came to Kentucky in 1999, they didn't have any credit for prior learning on any of my institutions. Only one, Northern Kentucky University, had a wonderful portfolio assessment, which we learned to adapt and to use with their assistance. Cale came in and helped us. We did the ALC. I could go on and on about my good friends from Cale, and you've had Judy here, luckily, so you have a good view on that, and you're all experts now on prior learning. So I can share, I don't have to share with some of those stories, and I'm sure I will. But what's happened is I became aware by the foundation's sudden interest in the college completion agenda has really caused a lot of, shall we call them random acts of progress or deliberate acts of funding to get random acts of progress or lighthouses or whatever. So we had the Bridges program from the Ford Foundation. We had Shifting Gears from Joyce. We had Lumina's Achieving the Dream. We had Breaking Through by numerous funders. I could go on with all of the grants. And to the extent that some colleges, I think, are just basically grant, overloaded, and what new projects are coming up from Lumina and so forth. But the fact is, I started seeing some real struggles in colleges. Colleges trying to offer things for their students, adult students primarily, but they couldn't get them offered for credit. They had to make all these arrangements to get things made so they could be accepted for credit in a variety of different ways. But they were doing some very novel things. And then working again nationally with the foundations when they supported Lumina's Learning Counts, which I think is a outstanding way to deal with what I think is a major issue, and that is how do we get to scale? And if you don't know the scale, I'm going to give you some other views of just how extensive it is. So if we're serious, which I think this country has got to be, about attainment and completion of meaningful degrees, then we've got to deal with this area. The other thing is the study of European educational reform. I've done a lot of work with international education with the U.S. Department of Education. I've worked with the Danes, worked with the Germans and a binational agreement there, and with a coalition of overseas institutions. And the European educational reform, some of you might know, is the Bologna. Some of my colleagues thought it was the Bologna reform, not the Bologna. And it's something that has really been intensely studied. One researcher, Institute of Higher Education Policy, Clifford Edelman, has done an awful lot with this. And there's things that we can learn from what they've been doing. After all, they've got 54 some countries, the EU, the common market and beyond, that they have to decide, how can you make this degree the same as in Portugal with one in England or so forth. So it's a major issue of portability and transparency that we're going to be talking about. And so that's played particularly with Lumina. And I'll give you some quick examples of what Lumina has been doing. And then ultimately is this growing interest in competency-based frameworks that define learning outcomes that enable institutions, students, employers to be very explicit about what specific knowledge and skills need to be taught and learned. You know, a series of basic questions that everything comes down to. So that's sort of the background other than my professional background. I'm going to talk about now the changing workforce and learning environment, which again is, I believe, everybody in here should be aware of. Increased focus on credentials, what do we mean by credentialing system, the disconnect between non-credit and credit learning, major focus of our paper, and then the shift to learning outcomes, what Lumen has done with its Tuning USA and also its degree qualifications profile, you know, just exactly where is that potentially going to take us. And then finally, which is basically the recommendation of the paper, is creating a competency-based qualifications framework. Not to be confused with the argument that I contributed to in Inside Higher Ed several weeks ago with an article about Western Governors University as a competency-based institution that was being outsourced to places like Indiana instead of developing their own institutions, and it was based on a competency-based model. The title of the article was Model of the Moment. This is not the model of the moment. So I say that real quick. The workforce and learning environment, just to say some quick things, obvious things, a growing skills gap we've had in this country. We have since ETS identified back with the perfect storm some 4 or 5 years ago, the demographics, the diversity, the baby boomers when we retire, which is not anytime soon thanks to the economy, and between the supply of graduates and employment demand. In fact, a lot of the studies, and since this paper was finalized, there's been at least 4 new studies by Tony Carnevale in the Center at Georgetown for Education and the Workforce, which you really need to read. I'm going to make some real reference to that, but they've been basically published between March with a presentation on Lumen and then 2 in the last week dealing with clusters and careers that are just extremely important. But one of the statements that the Georgetown Center made back in 2010 was that quite simply post-secondary was not capable of keeping up with the demand for jobs that were going to be needed by the time we had all of the impact of the economy change and also with retirements, and they started happening. And that was 3 million just to keep us basically competitive. Had nothing to do with the forecast of 8 million new jobs, because it's not only that we have jobs in demand, even today in high employment, but we also have new jobs and new skills. And if we're going to be competitive, I think we're going to need that 8 million that the President has called for the U.S. to remain competitive. The other major finding is that in this study of demand and matching forecast is that majors and credentials matter. A shock. Post-secondary education credentials is still the pathway to the middle class, in fact, even more. In 2007, from 1970, 61% had some post-secondary education, and that number continues to grow, a variety of different projections for it. And then the rapid acceleration of change, we know about technology, we know that the way in which companies are organizing work varies considerably. I just got done listening to an interesting discussion of Apple's new headquarters building. If you haven't seen that, they talk about a new complete change in that. So those are all, again, very important things. At the same time, and leading directly to the changes, is an increased emphasis on soft skills. And I always say that when I say soft skills because when I was working with skills standards back in the early 2000s, they referred to soft skills too. And then I looked at them, and if you remember the SCANS competencies, thinking, critical thinking, problem solving, working as a team, computation, written, oral, sounds to me like basic academic skills. Sounds to me like a good, solid, classical liberal arts background, and industry sometimes calls other skills foundation skills and employability skills. But actually, if you listen to what industry told us with skill standards, even in highly technical areas, they were saying to the institutions, whether it be 2-year or 4-year, look, we need you to focus on these broad academic skills to prepare people for the workplace. But don't go and give them everything you think they need to do the skills on the job, because we'll do that and those skills are going to change. And I want you to think about that as I come back and talk about competency-based education. Lifelong learning 3.0, since everybody likes to think like that. This actually I know to a colleague at SREB. Talked about pedagogy. I don't know what pedagogy is, andragogy. We all know what that is. And he introduced me to this term back about 3 years ago in Kentucky called hoidagogy. Has anyone heard of that term before? Well, you're going to have to Google it, and it's a little bit, and I have never heard it pronounced, so I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Some of you are Googling it now. You will find that it has to deal a lot. Yes, it has. Okay. So, self-directed, even with the caution we heard today. And I always liked it so much when I heard about it from Mike Garn, because part of it also related. In 1999, Bill Gates published a white paper for Microsoft that described what education was going to be like in the future as you formed your own study groups, as you carried your knowledge with you on your USB, as you did all this stuff. And I was absolutely fascinated by it, because so much of that has come true. So even though we deal with an older population, the generation that we've seen, that we've been tracking coming through our institutions, certainly are becoming far more wired than I think people understand. The other is something, the shared responsibility for learning between workers and employers is a major shift. I saw it occur at a meeting back right before the Bush administration, when a group of think tank people all got together and we sat around lamenting what we thought were going to be major changes in the federal government. But I guess there weren't any that we noticed. But we did say that probably the social contract was going to be affected. And in fact, I would say that it has. We're still seeing now that workers realize, 71% of workers realize they need to take responsibility for doing their own lifelong learning, because they can't depend like my father did working for the railroad for 40 years, and that they're going to have to do some other things and continue to make themselves get new skills that they can't do it. And industry also is recognizing that they too have a responsibility from some reports that I've seen, if they're going to maintain workers who can be competitive. And then a couple quick slides just to show you, if there's anything we have that's approached a national consensus today in this country, which some might argue is difficult with anything anymore, it's the focus on increasing attainment of credentials. Now, the mantra has changed a little bit and significant in a certain sense. I'll tell you very quickly, in the sense that it used to be only degrees. When the Council for Post-Secondary Education did its increased credential attainment in Kentucky and its goals for 2020, it talked specifically about degrees. And in fact, it focused on the baccalaureate degree. The one failing that they had, which NCHEMS and Dennis Jones pointed out to them later, was that if they were successful with their work in increasing baccalaureate attainment in Kentucky, one of their biggest new exports would be baccalaureate students, because they didn't have the jobs. Because another realization that has occurred which is also part of my systems change theory, and everybody else's too, is that economic and workforce development in higher education have got to work together in new ways and new combinations. It can't be silos. And I actually at one point had to hear the Department of Commerce Secretary in Kentucky get up and make a presentation to the Council on Post-Secondary Education Board with all of the charts showing all of our K through 12 performance and all of our college. And I thought when the economic development people finally start making presentations, you know you've got a job to do. But here's just names you know very well or programs that have occurred, and I'm sure you can think of state, you can think of local. I can think of Louisville, which has a credential attainment program in Kentucky, but certainly American Graduation Initiative, which, as you know, was never funded, but the idea of getting $5 million more college graduates by 2020 has not gone away. National Governors Association, I worked with them on their program to identify states in initial competition. Access to Success, Education Trust, 24 higher ed systems. Lumina's big goal to increase proportion of Americans with high quality degrees and credentials to 60% by 2025. I was there right after a board meeting last summer, and I think the staff was feeling the pressure of the board saying, where's the numbers? So those are real numbers to those people. SREBs, Promoting Culture of Student Success, a group that I've worked with now in several different ways and hope to continue, and that's Complete College America. It's up, I think, at least to 27, so I didn't update the slide. And then Completion by Design just started. I've been working with a group of colleagues there on actually the antecedents precedence of that program. And then last week, the Institute for Higher Education Policy announced this National Coalition for College Completion. So this is again, I think this is good. What we do see is some very obvious disconnects that we have to deal with. And I'll give you an idea of these. This is based on some research from a new publication in March called Across the Great Divide. If you haven't, and I'll send out a revised bibliography too, because I've got about 6 on there that are sort of must-reads if you like this stuff. But the different perspective on the priorities of post-secondary education, majority of employers, 56%, we're talking about the fact that they could not get workers that were really job ready, that they couldn't find workers. Even in Michigan, in manufacturing, we couldn't get the right trained workers in spite of tremendous unemployment in the automotive industry. The current credentialing system that we do have with all the credentials that are out there, confusing, I'll use the word chaotic later, both to employers, students, and some might even say educators with different language and standards. But I give you some examples of just credentials that I think are interesting, and I'm just curious to see if these are surprise to people, because this is something that Tony Carnevale did after about 3 years ago, and I asked him about it, and he said, well, it was just time I think I needed to go back and look. But 43% of all certificate and license holders out-earn the average earnings of an associate degree holder, 43%. 27% of those licenses and certificates outdo a bachelor's degree, and you know the numbers. Some of you are nodding, and those were a real surprise to people. But the immediate goes back to something I said earlier, and that is majors matter. What you decide you want to major in terms of what your earnings are, is something very important. It'll come back to the other big issue that we face in this country, and that is the really lack of any kind of national system of career navigation. And that's another a whole other issue. The disconnect between post-secondary education and workforce and other educational partners, this has been, believe it or not, for all the press that community colleges have gotten, this is actually a very critical assessment of community colleges of not being as tightly locked to the labor market, particularly with occupational programs. It goes back to the statement again that we're not looking with all our system, whether it's university education or with community colleges, in terms of making sure that we're looking at those forecasts. And then when we start to look at the public workforce system, you find a real dilemma in the sense that up until, well, I'd still say it's probably the trend, the public workforce system is really a labor exchange. It does not, it does short-term programs. It gets people into a job, but it doesn't take the time to give them the kind of training that will prepare them, give them a foundation or a real leg up on getting further training. And this, in spite of reports like the state of Washington, which has an outstanding longitudinal student database and actually has both wage files as well as education files that can be merged, actually determined that to have a sustainable job, you needed to have a minimum of 1 year of post-secondary education with a credential, just to build on. And that's something. So the idea of all these short-term courses, you know, there's a real danger in looking at it, and we've got to improve it. Fortunately, the Department of Labor, in this national consensus on degree attainment, suddenly realized and put out an announcement that they had to be part of this national issue. And in Michigan, for example, they came up with a program called No Worker Left Behind that paid for at least a year, and in some cases beyond that, to get people into upper level degrees so that they in fact could get the jobs that were needed in the regional labor market. And that program has been very well documented, and it's a good example of a better use of public funds. And it's also something with the, if you're familiar with one-stops, to provide support for while people are going through training. We certainly know from our work with adult students the many barriers they have, and we need to adopt and use some of those integrated services between the public workforce system and their money to help support our students, not just during education, but also afterwards and post-employment. So there's got to be a completely new way of thinking. We do have reauthorization of the public workforce system this year, and there are people talking about this in the right way. And one other good sign you should know about, I was thrilled to see it, but the Department of Labor, when they put out their call for the Department of Labor education and training grants, they were called community colleges, but basically it's an associate degree granting institution. So there were some universities involved in those consortiums. They had, as two of their best practices or strategies, they had either providing for articulation of non-credit education or for assessing prior learning as, again, as strategies. And I think that was a very powerful support from labor. The other surprise is, and maybe a surprise for you, but currently too few employees are involved in assisting institutions directly or working through industry sector partnerships to develop cost-effective relevant certificate degree programs. There's a great deal of interest in industry because they're starting to recognize, to be competitive, obviously they need to do this, but that basically the percentage I've seen in terms of direct, it's only about 13% of businesses. But again, the good news is they're looking to do that. But that's simply, for a competency-based system to work, you've got to have a full engagement of employers with faculty, or it simply doesn't work. The challenges I see to all of this is certainly proliferation of credentials, certificates. I think there's about 750,000 credit-bearing in iPads How many non-credit certificates by all providers would you think? I'd even hesitate to guess. Certifications, there are at least 3,000 to 4,000 certifications taken by millions and millions of Americans. There's licenses, there's license to practice issued by states, and actually my company has done work with several states, one state in particular, because I think it was the lieutenant governor wanted to increase in 2 years all credentials by 20%. So what's the first thing you have to do? What's the credential? And then how is that actionable? How do you decide you're going to approach that? And actually we did get it down, and the Department of Commerce in that particular state said, well, we don't have any role with this because we don't issue any credentials. By the time they were over with, they realized that they were a major influencer in determining what credentials were needed. So again, system change. It was a good example. The other thing that we have as a challenge is the competencies. When you look at job task analysis, job task, knowledge, skills, and abilities. And again, I'm not talking not just about job specific. I'm talking about quote unquote the soft skills that need to be consistently defined and understood by both the faculty and the employers. And then also we know that there's got to be transparency. We hear that so much. I'm sure all of you have heard it about high schools, employers complaining, what does a high school credential mean? Well, they're saying it about college credentials too, whether it's coming from Lynn College in Vermont or Keene State College in New Hampshire. What's it mean, or what's compared to Franklin Pierce College or Southern New Hampshire University? That lack of transparency, that issue that affected Europe so much. And then the challenges where a lot of these have mixed value in the labor market. I've been working a lot recently with the Department of Energy, and they have been looking at credentials intensely because, as I'll show you later, the energy areas, it's such a new emerging field that what credentials there are there have got to be re-examined. The technology is changing so quick. The certifications that have been there, there's one that I call her the Chief Learning Officer for the Department of Energy. She says is simply not worth the time or money for a student to take it or an institution to offer it because it doesn't have the meaning. It's a worthless credential. Well, how will you as a student know that, or as an institution? So, buyer beware is very much an issue. And then again, the lack of portability and articulation in education. If you can't validate, it makes that much more difficult for these programs to be assessed, particularly when a lot of these credentials, are not subject to third-party accreditation or validation or not even perhaps annually reviewed. Sir. This was in the energy area. It was in the area of renewable energy. I don't know the exact credential. I could find out, but it was one that was given as a specific example. In fact, I would tell you, looking ahead on all this, both the Department of Labor and the Department of Energy would love to have a public database that would be available to anybody that would basically show what programs of study and what credentials were in fact validated. Now, in this case, it was the Department of Energy on the basis of the fact that it was not capturing the competencies required for the job that it was advertised for. Very, very specific to that field, which again, most of them would be. And because that's the other issue, sometimes, many of my colleagues focus on the Department of Labor. There are so many other of the cabinets, and the secretaries in D.C. that do an awful lot of work with education and training that want to partner with universities, want to partner with higher education, that we could expand more. And that, again, is part of the opportunity I think we have. Another statement that's often made is our existing educational system is focused too often on one style of student learning, and in many cases the funding formula is based on attendance as opposed to performance. Yes.
Do you know, was there any documentation in that on the Department of Energy, whether the cost effectiveness of going towards these specific job viability, make them where they were job viable, was it cost effective to the university or anything, or would it be, or was it just for a small amount?
In this case, it would not. It was only for this one program, and for any individual, they would advise against it, and they would not support it. In fact, the Department of Energy has been coming out for RFPs for new programs in renewable energy, where they have been stressing that the program must be accredited. In this case, I've seen 2 of them that require the American National Standards Institute's certificate accreditation. So they're asking for, again, a very validated process, a yearly review, actual stated provable learning outcomes. The transfer issues, and I include prior learning assessment in this. When they did the announcement for Learning Counts, I was sitting next to Peter Smith, who was the former Lieutenant Governor of Vermont, who'd been the founder of the Community College Without Walls in Vermont, and had been later president at University of California State at Monterey, and has published a number of books. He's very provoking in thoughts. He took the idea of transfer and the idea of prior learning and sort of gave me a new filter to see them through, which is basically from a standpoint of sort of, this was the institutional guardians, against the use of where they're not being used, because, the fact is that even though a lot of institutions are aware of prior assessment, it's not used to the extent that it needs to be used. And particularly in transfer, which I've struggled with in 3 states, and then where I've seen very successful examples of other states, the major difference is where you're not dealing one-on-one with a faculty chair or faculty member or a program or a college within a university, but where you're dealing much more on a system level, where there's agreements, where there's a common way of talking about what the objectives of the course are. I did that with engineering at the University of Kentucky, for example, where we matched up every course objective, to enable a student taking that course at any other college to transfer. But you know how much work that takes times every program. And so, in the absence of any kind of external pressure to do that on a more effective basis, it's a major, major issue. And then, as I said, the lack of a career navigation framework is a very serious issue. I wanted to give you a picture. This is our credentialing system in the U.S. And yes, exactly. Storm fronts moving in. The Torcon value, for example, on no, but you have, again, professional associations, companies, vendors, certification boards, academic, state boards, state regulation, government, professional, certification, accreditation. One of the Gates staff presented this based on some work that we had been doing with the American National Standards Institute, and there's a couple of more pictorial demonstrations, but try making sense of all this and trying to establish and then try to, advise students now on what's the best way to go, which goes back to that energy, how would someone know? And by the way, I'll mention it now because I didn't put it on, but there's a program, for those of you who work with military, if you're not, how many of you are aware of this? I know, but it's the Navy and Army Cool program. It's fantastic because I think it's the way everybody wants to go with one change, having talked to the person that put it together. It's basically an online system that, for example, the Navy, you can go in and you can look at your officer, classifications and training, your enlisted, civilian, and then it takes you across, shows you the civilian counterpart, the program, and then it even takes you to accreditation or to credentials. Taking their ratings, what they've been, the skill they've been developing and gaining, and then cross-rating it over to the other side, to the civilian side, and then also providing that bridge of how to fund it. Right. Yeah. In fact, it says on there. That's right. There's dollar signs according to where the funding is, because the Navy pays for some funding, Army does not. I found that. I was talking to the person who set this up. What they want to do next is they want to go back and say which credential is really the validated credential that you should be getting that will make a difference, you know, in you getting a job or keeping a job or advancing. That's the next step. But I just thought it was, you know, we've been working on this paper and we've been showing it to people all around the country, and somebody came up with this and said, you ought to look at it. And I said, wow. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Thank you. You may have said this, and I may have missed it. What kind of work have you, or what kind of, I guess, look-see have you taken at professional organizations and their role in credentialing? For example, NEA, or I'm a counselor, so the American Counseling Association has a vested interest in looking at portability and credentials for professional counselors.
Well, that's part of the reason we're going on the road now with talking to as many different groups as we can, to talking about the professional associations, you know, in whether it's you know, universities, organizations, or two-year colleges, or these other associations, because there has been, if you see in the paper who the readers were, you can tell the foundations are acutely interested in this area. And also a number of the research organizations too, because it does represent, particularly when I get to the numbers, which hopefully will be in a few seconds. But key questions here, that sort of, I was doing some work for the U.S. Department of Education looking at the European system, but basically tried to, what are we trying to understand? If we were creating a competency-based system, or what is it that Europe's trying to do, or what is it that we should be trying to do? And these questions are really, you know, try to make them down as fundamental as they can be, but how do we know, how do we really know at our institutions that we are teaching the competencies required of a field of study, as you'll see with Lumina, or whether it's a specific career pathway? And then how can students demonstrate that they know what it is that they should have learned in a way that is you know, beyond assessment, if I can use that term. And then again, how are these portable? Are in fact they recognized by industry? Are they recognized by other institutions of higher ed? And then, to me, always the important question, how do we know that students have the lifelong learning skills, the learning how to learn skills that I'll mention later on, that are so important that will allow them to continue to adapt? If someone does not have adaptive expertise to be able to change and to be able to bring knowledge together, kind of it relates to today's speaker at lunch about the way there is creativity and innovation. It really is in bringing ideas and combining those together. And lifelong learning versus job training. A lot of times the issue that you'll get into in some of these discussions is, well, we're talking about education, you're talking about training. I'm not talking about training, I'm talking about education for the whole person. And even though there is a disconnect sometimes because the majority of employers believe that people should be prepared for the workplace with broad academic knowledge, you know, many educators believe that that's not the job at all, that that's a second priority or certainly secondary in terms of preparing people for any specific job. And I think there's room for that discussion to take place. Yes.
Yeah, because, you know, if you go back on your previous slide where you've got those fundamental questions, Okay, I think the point you raised, comes up loud and clear, because those questions all appear to be about not preparing, at least in a lot of faculty's minds, students for citizenship in a greater society, which is what the traditional role of a college education is, but preparing people for a job. Okay, and that's what all of those questions seem to be, and especially the last one, okay, which struck me as interesting. So what exactly is the difference then in this model between preparing for the next job and lifelong learning? It seems to me they become synonymous.
Will you hold that, if you would, and we'll come back to it after I show you what Lumina has done with their degree profile, because it is part at the heart of the matter, and it's part of a real debate that I've seen worked out in meetings that I've had with provosts and states over who's doing what, particularly as it comes in terms of the role between a regional university and the role between research and community colleges. Addressing these issues, obviously, these are our recommendations, again, in several forms. Focus on learning outcomes in their widest sense. Expand the role of employee engagement. That's a subject I can tell you that industry is tremendously interested in, and I know that there are examples of programs out there at your institutions where you've got great one-on-one relationship with businesses, and the issue is, again, that's another one of how we take the scale and deal with consortium, with what we call sector-based. Expand the linkages that we already have that are working so well between non-credit and credit to take these innovative efforts like learning counts and state and institutional efforts. I think there's only one state that I know of that actually passed legislation requiring that the state institution, public institutions assess and award prior learning. That's Minnesota, from the work that we've seen. And then create this broad-based national. And that won't be something that happens. To show you an example, to go back to energy again, and why it happened is, in addition to an awful lot of meetings last year in Washington, D.C., with labor and a variety of other departments, education obviously, a group of people from the Center on Wisconsin Strategies met to talk about the energy area. And this is sort of their statement of why credentials matter to them. That because it's, in their view of it, is it's just absolutely a mess, the whole American labor market, without having common standards and having the credentials, obviously, that support standards, and then knowing the results that can come, which we've seen certainly in the work that we've done with sectors, as I'll point out later, that a competency-based credential system actually reduces cost for employers and actually helps employees, helps students guarantee quality work and quality jobs. The disconnect, these are my numbers here. I'm just curious to see if these surprise anybody. Roughly half of the enrollment in post-secondary education in this country is non-credit. Okay, 20.8 million, nearly half of the 43 million post-secondary students. 13 million are what I call Title IV educational institutions of all types. And then, this is unpublished research from, as far as I know it's unpublished, from the Georgetown Center, is outside of educational institutions, that whole universe of people ranging from, private vendors to community-based organizations, the military, professional association, employers, and so forth. There's 7.8 million students that the Georgetown Center feels are involved in non-credit education that in fact is highly correlatable. Is that a word? Highly correlated. Yeah. To credit work done properly, documented, et cetera, et cetera. And that, and our premise is, again, unless we can get major increases in scale, we simply cannot do enough through individual programmatic articulation agreements, as great as they are, or even assessing prior learning, particularly the issue we've had with prior learning. I'm sure Judy must have mentioned too, it's the cost factor and who pays for it. And that's a public policy issue too, which I think we can take on if we do. Does those numbers surprise anybody?
I don't know how you count. I think a bigger challenge, and you referenced a couple of slides back, is this proliferation of non-credit.
Right.
And is it legitimate or illegitimate? We don't collect data regularly on it. We don't even have definition of what is some type of certification. We know of some, and we kind of rally around those. But generally speaking, I mean, one of the concerns that I have about even the 60% big goal of Lumina is they parenthetically add and certification, other credentials, certificates, and nobody defined those. We have no way of collecting information on those. That number, Tony's number, may be right, but who knows?
Well, and I've had the benefit of the last 2 years of working for the American Standards Institute with this accreditation of certificates, and I can tell you that looking at both unaccredited certifications and ANSI certifications, you're talking millions. And when you look at the process of what the accreditation and how it's done, you realize there's almost two different worlds out there. And you and I were talking earlier about, I mean, talk about language. You can almost not understand these people. They're tremendous educators, but it's a completely different vocabulary. And I would say it's like working, I thought there were silos within our institutions. There are silos everywhere, apparently. Barriers to attainment in the non-credit world, my favorite subject, and who's going to take it on, right? The credit hour. Lumina did a really great job with this the other day that I didn't know. They published, I think it's one of their magazines. And I obviously think that I knew that the credit hour was used to estimate faculty load. I mean, I grew up with that. It matters of efficiency, and we had to cut back interdisciplinary programs at my university not because they were ineffective or was an entire honors program, but because they used too much faculty time. But I didn't realize the history of them goes back to as measurements of faculty load to calculate faculty retirement. So the credit hour is actually the father and mother of my TIA CREF program. I had no idea. And so, it's locked in the system. I've seen passionate arguments on this. I got so excited with the Department of Labor, the Department of Education came out and actually had a phrase in definition of a credit hour, their new one that they proposed, saying that it was going to be related to outcomes or competencies. And I said, there, and I wrote it in our paper and I sent the draft off, and what I got back from Washington and my colleagues at class was, are you crazy? Look at the rest of the proposal. The rest of the proposal was, for the first time, Department of Education was going to come in and dictate what a credit hour was to an institution in terms of time-based, seat time-based education. And so all the innovation and all of the things that a number of institutions had the freedom with their accrediting associations, were allowing them to do, were now being thrown out, potentially out the window. Needless to say, that did not make the final draft. But I appreciate the effort, but this is the only place I'm mentioning that. But it truly is the barrier. That's why this is not going to be a short-term issue. And the lack of criteria, the processes for assuring the quality of a wide variety of education and employer-based credentials, going back to that, not receiving the level of credential equivalency. I've sometimes had issues with ACE, for example, and some things where somebody went out, and I've done this myself. I've served on teams with subject matter experts, and we've one program we did, we analyzed all the offerings of the State Fire Academy, and we came up with 20 credits. Okay. I think it was a good process. I believed in it, but was that the best system for doing that? Maybe it was 22, but then again, we're back to using credit hours for doing that as opposed to for doing that. And again, not being portable is again a real issue for transparent employers, educators, or students. Yes.
What is felt to be critical variable for attaining or achieving outcomes? I'm talking about people's intelligence, people's the seat time, prior learning, the environment. All those things are going to be variables that will contribute to the attainment of outcomes.
That's correct.
How is that going to be less complicated than what appears to be simplistic on the surface with the credit hour?
Well, we called it performance-based funding 15 years ago before we had the technology to address it, and particularly with e-learning and moving assessment back to the point of assessment and requiring multiple kinds of assessments, both summative and formative. I mean, I've seen the results. I've got some really good studies that the Department of Energy has done with regards to student engagement, but ultimately, it is on performance, on what a student can do, and that's faculty based. And that's the key, but it's agreed upon reference points. Again, I'll show you a little bit more detail, but this conversation will only begin to ask the kind of question and get it answered that you just did. I mean, it's just the beginning of it. Because I'll show you, let me go a little bit further here. These are crosswalks. These are examples that are in your book that you can read. We found a lot of other good examples, especially when we finished it, people came up and said, look at what we were doing. So there's even more stuff going on out there where people are crosswalking, and obviously we know about CLEP, we know about Dante's, we know about that, crosswalking. These are all things that people are doing to make the current system and to create those linkages that we think should be encouraged. We think foundations, and we think government and state policy ought to do that. This is the system. This is going in towards the Lumina thing, which I want to go to your points here and yours, is, again, going back to the credit hours, going back to credentials as proxies for competencies, looking at input-based rather than outcome-based models. I could talk, but these, again, are examples that are in your paper, so I'm not going to take the time, except when we're going in looking at what is to be assessed, we're getting down to a very granular level of both what specific skills are needed for a specific area. For example, in the auto industry, let's say it's maintenance. What skills are needed? What type of problem solving, critical thinking, preventive, the soft skills that they're going to need? How they're identified by the subject matter experts from industry and faculty. In the case of this automotive, which is a 9-state consortium with 24 colleges and all the major manufacturing companies, and it's operated now globally, and the assessments for that program are given globally to start the program and to finish it. They basically are doing first a DACM. You're all familiar with the DACM, designing a curriculum. This one, they call it an enhanced DACM. Then they do a Delphi, where they do a 3-process comparing the subject matter experts with the faculty. And the faculty, it consists of secondary, community college, and university level faculty and researchers in the area. And then everything is reduced down to data points. And so then they compare and they can see where the priorities are of the competencies that should be taught. And when I look at a competency-based program, I'm thinking that 80%, to take a figure, are things that are common across all industry, all businesses, all fields. Beyond that is the institution and the faculty should add anything that they feel adds value to the program so that you can have and recognize diversity in the program that has that. The results of where these things have been used is documented. They're used in over 25 states now, and in 2 third-party studies, they've actually reduced tremendous opportunities, savings for both companies and provided workers with skills and gets them new jobs and gives them a leg up. So it works. When you turn now to Lumina, the thing I want to talk about Lumina is that what they wanted to do was to explicitly define what a degree in a given field represents, explicitly, with reference points that can be explainable and understandable to people looking at them. They're criterion referenced, learning outcomes. They set the process they call in Europe, they sometimes call tuning harmonization. That means something to you. It started, they involved 3 states. Here's the majors: chemistry, education, graphic design, history, and physics. And they brought together, first of all, the researchers, and then surveys of faculty members, and then they had study groups involving these, and then brought them together to reach consensus on shared definitions and shared reference points. I mean, this is monumental. Now, I will tell you, I think Lumen is not sure where they're going next with this, because it is monumental. You know, and remember, it's one thing to look at Europe with 50-some countries. Well, we're a country that had 50 states the last time I looked, and, you know, national involuntary reforms have not gone very far, to say the least. So that's a start. Then we go into their degree profile, which was their next evolution, which is they were going to look at associate, bachelor's, and master's level. Now, they say in conversations that we've had with them, with my colleagues at Lumina, they want to look at the other level of credentials because they agree that that's important. But they also agree it is a huge, huge undertaking. So we haven't heard the final answer as to that, but it's exactly to your point on all these credentials out there. They have defined learning, and I'm going to show you their picture, which is worth 1,000 words, 5 learning areas: specialized knowledge, broad integrative knowledge, intellectual skills, applied learning, and civic learning. In our view of applied learning, that's where assessment for prior learning comes in very much so. And then descriptive outcomes at each degree level. I'll give you a quick example of their associate degree versus their bachelor. They've had this out twice now. This is its 2nd iteration, and they're looking for feedback. So if you're interested, go to the Lumina website and let them have it, you know. But this is what the profile looks like. I don't think there's any symbolic anything about a pentagon, so yes.
I just wanted to offer some thoughts as a faculty member that, and I'm aware of the good work that Lumina does, but we faculty are a persnickety bunch. Can I say that for the faculty in the room?
I am one.
Okay. So we are trained at the doctoral level to be content experts, or subject matter experts. I'm a little, and I know you don't represent Lumina, but I'm a little concerned about how an outside organization, because really when you look at how faculty teach students, a lot of us aren't trained as teachers. We're content experts. So when you look at the kinds of, that previous slide, when you look at the kinds of things that we're being asked, that they would ask us to do, that really doesn't take into the account the way the vast majority of faculty are trained for universities, colleges, or even technical schools, from my perspective, which is only one, but just a thought.
No, that is a key issue. And the reaction of faculty to some of these discussions, as well as some of the other discussions that are going on around accountability. If you looked at Inside Higher Ed today and you saw that article on the Department of Education's, what is it? Is it accreditation and integrity, as seeing what they're looking to do about potentially doing away with regional accreditation as we know it, and looking at the entire peer-based way in which we do things, and have separate, and then also get universities out of the financial aid approval business. I mean, these are major things that are being discussed. So you add that with the whole issue on gainful employment, which is a double-edged sword. You have, I mean, Inside Higher Ed today, that's probably, before I go to the Chronicle, I go to that, and then I go to the comment section, because that's where I see all the faculty saying, are you crazy? And yes, I know that because my entire methodology as a teacher was going to one seminar and watching 4 of the senior professors at Duke speak. And I wrote a page, 2 pages on each of them. That was my entire indoctrination to teaching. So,
don't you think that there is a move more, though, for higher ed to become better teachers?
Absolutely.
And I mean, this has been going on for a while. And, getting away from the chalk and talk and doing the things that, I mean, this is not something totally out of the blue. It may be that it's still not in practice as much, but I think especially in the 2-year realm, it's a little bit more of a push.
Well, the one problem that I feel that we need to address is we really need far more research on some of these areas that I feel there's documentation beginning. But last year, 2 years ago, we made a report, the Community College Research Center at Teachers College at Columbia. I was a member of that, to Gates, on what were effective methods that were empirically proven to work. The only one that they could report on in teaching methodology was contextual learning. Now, so we need a lot more research in this, and calling for much more of an evidence-based culture. I've seen some figures that we were talking about today with e-learning from the Department of Energy on student engagement and how many questions are asked in different formats of everything from blended learning down to a lecture. And, you've got to be impressed with figures like that. But I think, people are very much of a show-me sort of environment. So I would say, yes, I think we have it, and we intuitively we know, perhaps, or anecdotally we know, but, faculty are a tough group.
Yeah,
we are.
I'm just concerned because it looks like a lot of Lumina's vision is coming from the European experience with the Bologna Accords. There's a storm front coming in Europe. A lot of my colleagues there are convinced that is just an attempt by industry to take over, to begin teaching students things instead of thinking. And I'm hearing it more and more from people in Europe that there is a lot of pushback on that.
If you look up Bologna Inside Higher Ed today, you will find that expressed over and over. You will find it rebutted over and over. I just think it's interesting that Lumina, when they went into this, they have never said they were borrowing or suggesting Bologna is a model. They said, how can we look at this? Is there anything that we can learn to avoid or whatever? But that's the crux of the matter. There's not a thing that you said that isn't something that I wouldn't say about that. But, this is a slide from my Lumina partner the other day, where, again, it goes almost back to the credit hour, and it almost goes back to what are we really looking to do if we're going to transform, because we have an issue where the United States, if there are people in this country who believe we have the best healthcare system in the world, I would, do we have the best higher education system in the world? In some ways, we do. In other ways, we could benefit, and I've compared engineering degrees from 2 other well-known producers that I would give up I would say our engineering students are superior in terms of the way they're taught. But be that all as it may, is we've got some real countervailing issues we need to deal with. And maybe it comes down to this, and then I'll shut up and maybe do some few more questions or lynchings in the back here. But this is the president of Lumina, and I like what he says here because it goes back to the fundamental question of, competencies. It goes back to, can we objectively measure learning? I think, yes, we can. These measurements are vital. Are we doing it now? I mean, something mystical used to happen in my classroom. I don't know, when I would lecture. But I think the essence, to me, it's always that we need to teach students constantly to learn how to learn, to equip them, for the skills, for the changes that all these things are going to come about. So I think what we did, and if this is any indication, I thank you from the bottom of my heart, and my colleagues will too, is to start a dialogue on this that is one that will really get at the issue of what it takes to increase attainment so that people can have good jobs and sustain families, and the U.S. can be competitive. Because ultimately, I also didn't tell you I'm a military historian too, but I know I kind of did. But it's an issue of national defense in terms of our education. So I take it very seriously. So if there's any other questions, if not, I'm not going anywhere. I'll be glad. But you have raised the issues, and when Mary Ellen and I talked, we anticipated that I would be looking forward to your reaction, and I would encourage you to write me and respond. And if you haven't had a chance to look at that paper yet, look at it, because there's a lot of information in there. The good news is people are working hard out there, and the bad news is there's so many things going on right now that threaten a lot of good things that we're doing. So thank you.